side, in time for our regular look at the week ahead. Iran and international negotiators have less than 24 hours to secure an agreement on the country's nuclear program. As we mentioned, Secretary of State John Kerry has been in trilateral talks with Iran's foreign minister and with the European Union's chief negotiator, Catherine Ashton. The U.S. says gaps still remain in closing the deal, which could mean another extension. Here's Courtney Keeley with some background.
In 1967, during an era of close ties with the U.S., Washington sold Iran its first nuclear research reactor. That relationship fell apart 12 years later, after the Shah was overthrown and Iranian revolutionaries held 52 Americans hostage for over a year. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini initially shut down Iran's nuclear program, only to restart it in 1984 during the Iran-Iraq War. By 1992, Israel was raising the alarm that Iran would have nuclear weapons within 10 years. The U.S. echoed those warnings.
Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror.
Reports surfaced in 2002 that Iran had secretly built a uranium enrichment facility at Natanz, and a year later, international inspectors found traces of enriched weapons-grade uranium there. But under international pressure, Iran agreed to suspend its enrichment program and allow international inspections. After the election of the hardline Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran changed course. The new president defiantly celebrated Iran's return to uranium enrichment, even though the United Nations Security Council voted unanimously to impose sanctions on Iran in 2006.
He literally squandered billions of dollars of Iran's oil revenue while he was president from 2005 to 2013. In those 8 years, he brought about huge damage to the Iranian economy.
By 2013, Iran's oil exports were cut in half by sanctions. With Ahmadinejad barred from seeking a third term by Iran's constitution, Hassan Rouhani was elected president, promising a new attitude towards the outside world.
End of the day, this is a country that, unlike other sort of dictatorships out there, or authoritarian systems, if I want to call it that, relies on trading with the rest of the world.
With a phone call several months later, President Rouhani and President Obama had the first high-level contact between the U.S. and Iran in 34 years. It paved the way for these nearly year-long nuclear negotiations, during which Iran's nuclear program has been suspended and some of its uranium supply diluted. In exchange, Iran gained access to billions of dollars of previously frozen assets. But the biggest obstacle is Iran's desire to maintain its ability to produce enriched uranium that can be used in power reactors, medical research, and in high quantities nuclear weapons. Iran has signaled a willingness to ship most of its uranium stockpile to Russia for conversion into specialized fuel rods, which could be used for its one commercial nuclear plant. Russia is also interested in building more civilian plants in Iran and helping oversee them to help world powers monitor Iran's program and ensure that its enrichment program is strictly for peaceful purposes. Courtney Keeley, Al Jazeera.
By most accounts, one of the main sticking points between the two sides is how much sanction relief Iran will get in exchange for whatever it eventually gives up. One of the reasons why Washington is reluctant to lift sanctions is Tehran's refusal to dismantle most of its centrifuges. Those are used to enrich uranium for a variety of purposes here, peaceful as well as military. Back at home, selling any agreement will prove to be difficult. Democrats and Republicans alike oppose any agreement with Iran. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani faces many of the same pressures. If a deal is reached, he'll need the approval of hardliners in Tehran, many of whom don't want to any deal with America. To talk more about the agreement, let's bring in Emad Kiyaei, a researcher for the program on science and global security at Princeton University, and Ali Heinonen, senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs of the Harvard Kennedy School, who's joining us from Watertown, Massachusetts. Gentlemen, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, here we are, another possible extension. Realistically, Mr. Kiyaei, how far apart are we in reaching a nuclear deal?
Well, there's two issues at hand here. One is technical and one is political. On the technical aspect, I believe that the two sides have bridged a lot of their differences, and while there is some remaining issues, since it is technical, we have solutions to those. Unfortunately, as you've mentioned in the piece, there needs to be a political will for us to be able to push this nuclear deal forward. And Where it lacks is our hawks in Washington and Tehran, who both want this deal not to happen. So I believe on a technical aspect, there is a lot of movement, and on the political one, it requires political will, political capital, and a lot of wrangling between the two parties to see how does a final comprehensive deal look like between the P5+1 and Iran.
Mr. Heinonen, I'll phrase it this way. How far have we come in these Iran nuclear talks?
I think that there has been progress in the last 1 year, but as the previous speaker said, we still have the problems. And I think that the biggest problem is not only the number of centrifuges, but to define which are the practical uranium enrichment needs of Iran. And as in the previous segment, President Obama said, how to verify this agreement. This agreement needs to be verifiable. And those are, I think, the two most important technical questions which remain to be answered and agreed.
Do you see a greater shift, Mr. Kiyaei, by Iran to normalize relations with the West?
Definitely. I mean, President Rouhani came on a mandate of improving Iran's relations with the world, not just in the region, but with the international community, specifically the Western world, including the United States. So based on just that mandate, and I believe President Rouhani has shown through the team that he's selected, Dr. Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, and Iran's overall strategy to resolve their differences with the international community to come out of the international isolation they've been feeling for the past couple of years.
What is needed from both sides, Iran and the West, Mr. Heinonen? Do we need to see less rhetoric?
For sure, and I think at the recent days the negotiations have shown that the atmosphere, at least in public, is fairly good. What happens inside the meeting rooms, there might be a little bit hard talk. But this really goes back to this basic question that which are the uranium enrichment needs of Iran? Currently, it looks to me, from technical point of view, that Iran doesn't need 19,000 centrifuges to provide medical isotopes for people who are sick.
There's a huge prize on the table.
So they have to come down with the numbers.
They do need to come down with the numbers. That's what's being discussed. I want to talk about the huge prize that's on the table, Mr. Kiyaei. Who benefits the most?
I think the international community benefits. I think the region benefits. If Iran and the US, through these nuclear talks, come to a resolution, it is the first and the most powerful key to open up bilateral relations to discuss an array of issues that are not just in the national interest of Iran, but also the United States and regional powers. There are issues such as the fight against ISIS, which is now at the height of US foreign policy dilemma in the Middle East. It will become very important for Persian Gulf security, for the stability of Iraq, of Syria, of Afghanistan. The key to this is to resolve this decades-old marred relations between US and Iran. And I believe if that happens, we are going to have a new chapter for a region that is being embroiled in conflicts and is raging on now.
And Russia benefits as well.
Of course it does. I believe it is important to, when you lay down this comprehensive deal on the nuclear issue, that we realize that a year ago, just a year ago, the breakthrough after a decade of nuclear negotiations was primarily based on the fact that President Obama mentioned that he wants a deal with Iran, and vice versa, Mr. Rouhani. And it is backed up by a great team in both capitals, and most importantly, within the Iranian leadership structure, we have Ayatollah Khamenei, that he's given the green light to the Rouhani administration to press ahead with a deal. So this is very important developments.
We're going to talk about Washington. The White House will be under pressure to really explain an extension to a skeptical Congress. Mike Vicara has more.
Going into the weekend, White House officials were making no secret of the fact that serious gaps remain between the P5+1 partners and Iran, and insist that the president would not sign what they would term a bad deal. U.S. officials say they have very simple goals, painting them in very broad terms. They want to make sure that Iran cannot obtain nuclear weapons, that pathways to making nuclear material are shut down, those centrifuges and heavy water plants, and they want verifiable assurances that the nuclear program in Iran is peaceful for civilian energy purposes and not for military purposes. And heading into the Vienna talks, U.S. officials said they were not there to talk about yet another extension. Recall that the talks were extended back in July. The new deadline is on Monday. So if there is another extension, the White House and the administration are going to have to answer a very basic question. Why? Is there an indication from Iran they are willing to meet the very basic goals of the United States to ensure that Iran's nuclear program is not for military purposes, is for civilian energy use, and is it going to be verifiable? Mike Vaquera, Al Jazeera, the White House.
Mr. Heinonen, once a deal is reached, this is going to be a very tough sell to Washington.
That's true. I think that there are people who are against it. But I think that let's see what is in the agreement and which are the details. If it addresses all the aspects of the concerns which the UN Security Council has expressed. So I think it then should be fairly easy. I mean, reasonable size enrichment program, let the IAEA really to verify not only how many centrifuges are in Iran, but verify the total inventory of the nuclear material in Iran, and address these military-related issues, which were one of the reasons why the Security Council ended up in this resolution. So it will be pretty much judged on the verification details, what will be how acceptable this agreement will be.
Mr. Kiyaei, your thoughts? Will it be harder, a tougher sell with a Republican-controlled Senate?
Yes and no. The American foreign policy actually gives a lot of power to the president and the administration to formulate and move ahead with their foreign policies. While the Congress, obviously Republican or Democrat, is going to be very much pro-Israeli in their approach and most probably very suspicious of a deal with the Iranians, will put into place obstacles in the way of Obama administration. But I believe if the Obama administration holds on to this approach that they're currently on, towards the road of rapprochement and a dialogue with the Iranians, I believe that there is a way to break through, even with the obstacles provided in the way of them by the Congress.
And we saw a warning earlier from Israel. Israel has been pushing for a complete halt to Iran's nuclear program, not just a downgrade. It's not part of its official talks, but Israeli officials are still making their demands known. Our Nick SCHIFRIN explains.
Under the proposed deal, Iran does not have to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure, and fundamentally that is what Israel objects to. Israel wants an Iran that cannot enrich uranium today or in the future at all. But that deal is not on the table, and so Israeli officials admit all they're trying to do now is convince the U.S. to sign as good a deal as possible with 5 aspects, the most important of which is known as the breakout time, a deal that expands the time Iran would need to build a nuclear weapon if it chose to years rather than 12 or more months as U.S. officials are negotiating. Israel wants Iran's centrifuges limited to a number below the 4,000 or 5,000 the U.S. officials are discussing. Israel wants Iran's research and development capacity completely removed. It wants more intense inspections. And perhaps most importantly, Israel wants a deal that lasts a decade. Many analysts believe that Israeli concerns about this deal actually helps push both sides and Iranian hardliners toward a deal. And so expect the criticism from Israel to continue now and even after a deal is signed.
If we don't get a deal, what does this mean, Mr. Heinonen, for the overall stability of the Middle East?
Well, it's certainly not positive, but I think that there will be a deal. But whether it will be there tomorrow, there are certainly doubts. But it's hard to believe that people now walk away and drop the whole case. So we will see an extension, and then we have to see if there is a political will to solve these fairly simple technical obstacles which are in front of us.
What does a solid nuclear deal look like, Mr. Kiyaei, that would satisfy Israel and the world powers?
I think what has been negotiated on is 3 issues, as Professor has mentioned. How do we verify Iran's nuclear program is peaceful? How do we monitor it? And how do we have transparency measures to ensure that whatever the Iranians are saying is true? Well, in the interim deal, all the international instruments that provide inspections, verification and monitoring were signed as an interim deal. And I believe if there is a comprehensive one, we can assure the international community, including the Israelis, that Iran's nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, because everything will be under the monitoring of the UN watchdog, nuclear watchdog, the IAEA. And I believe if this is the case, then we can prove, the Iranians, they can prove to the international community that under the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that they have signed, that ironically Israel has not, and where Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, whereas Israel does. Iran can prove that it can have a peaceful program for the benefit of its domestic economy and also play a more constructive role in non-proliferation throughout the region. And Iran has been backing for years a pursuit towards a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East that includes the eradication of all WMDs, including nuclear weapons. And the number one factor why we don't have a WMD free zone in the Middle East is because Israelis, ironically, are holding on to their arsenal.
When all is said and done, do you see relations between Iran and the West improving through this entire process?
Definitely. It is the first time after 35 years that only a year ago that these two governments, Iran and US, sat bilaterally. And I believe Secretary of State John Kerry and his counterpart, Dr. Zarif, have built up a relationship in the past year where I was actually at the UN General Assembly in September where they actually speak very casually together as if they've known each other for much longer than expected. And this has never happened in 35 years of mild relations. So I believe if relations between US and Iran improve, automatically, by its nature, US will open up Iran's economy and Iran's relations with the West will also improve.
Mr. Heinonen, your final thoughts?
Yes, I think that there are a lot of at stake, and we should not look this also in isolation from the other countries in the Middle East, because there are still concerns, particularly in the Gulf countries, that what is the real scope and nature of Iranian program, and if Iran now maintains the enrichment capacity, which it looks to me, they are going to ask the same right, and this might not be good in the area of Middle East. And therefore, I think that the only long-term solution is, as the previous speaker said, is this weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, which includes also chemical weapons, which some of the countries have and which need to be dismantled.
We'll certainly see. As we mentioned, the clock is ticking. We'll have to leave it there. Emad Kiyaei, a researcher for the Program on Science and Global Security at Princeton University, and Ali Heinonen, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Gentlemen, great to have you with us on the week ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.